I boarded the night train from the city, eager to escape the sweltering summer heat and return to my hometown. The train was a relic from another era, its dark green exterior weathered and worn. As I stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather and stale smoke, a far cry from the sterile, modern trains I was used to. The dim lighting cast long shadows along the narrow corridor, and the only sounds were the creaking of the wooden floorboards and the distant chugging of the engine. I found my compartment, a small, claustrophobic space with a single window and a faded red seat. I settled in, hoping to catch some sleep before arriving home. The train lurched forward, and I watched as the city lights slowly faded into the distance. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The conductor, an elderly man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes, shuffled past my compartment, his steps unnaturally slow. He glanced at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were devoid of any emotion, like twin pools of darkness. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that he was just an old man doing his job. As the night wore on, the train seemed to take on a life of its own. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks became a hypnotic, almost sinister sound. I decided to explore the train, hoping to find something to distract me from the growing sense of dread. The corridor was empty, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. I passed several compartments, all of them dark and silent. It was as if I were the only passenger on this ghostly train. I finally reached the dining car, where I hoped to find some signs of life. The dining car was a picture of decay. The tables were covered in dust, and the once elegant chandeliers hung crookedly from the ceiling. A single passenger sat at one of the tables, a middle-aged woman with wild, unkempt hair. She was muttering to herself, her eyes darting around the room as if she were seeing things that weren't there. I approached her cautiously. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you all right?" I asked. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "None of us should be here." Before I could ask her what she meant, the conductor appeared at the door. His presence seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. "Miss, you should return to your compartment," he said in a monotone voice. I nodded, too frightened to argue. As I made my way back, I heard the woman mutter, "We're all trapped. There's no way out." Back in my compartment, I tried to make sense of what was happening. The woman's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in grave danger. I decided to confront the conductor and demand an explanation. I found him in the engine room, staring out into the darkness. "What's going on here?" I demanded. "Why is everyone so strange?" He turned to me, his eyes as cold and empty as ever. "This train is no ordinary train," he said. "It carries lost souls, people who have nowhere else to go. Once you board, there's no leaving." I felt a surge of panic. "I want to get off this train," I insisted. "Now." He shook his head slowly. "It's too late. You're already a part of it." Desperate, I ran back to my compartment and grabbed my bag. I had to find a way to escape, no matter what. I made my way to the back of the train, hoping to find a way to jump off. But the door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut. In a last-ditch effort, I climbed onto the roof of the train. The night air was cold and biting, and the wind whipped at my hair and clothes. I looked down and saw the tracks speeding by beneath me. It was terrifying. but I knew I had no other choice. As I prepared to jump, I heard a voice behind me. "You can't escape," the conductor said. "You're one of us now." I turned to see him standing on the roof, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I took a deep breath and leaped into the darkness. The world spun around me, and I hit the ground hard. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to get up and run. I didn't stop until I reached a small, deserted road. I collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I never saw the train again, but its memory haunts me to this day. I don't know what happened to the other passengers, or if they ever found a way out. All I know is that I escaped, but a part of me will always be on that night train, lost and searching for a way home. The idea of traveling on an old train to seek inspiration for my new book seemed romantic and thrilling. I had heard about a particular line that operated vintage trains from the early 1900s, and it felt like the perfect setting to ignite my creativity. As a writer constantly searching for new ideas, the promise of a journey through history was irresistible. I boarded the train just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the platform. The locomotive itself was a masterpiece of old-world engineering, its polished brass fittings and dark green carriages exuding an air of elegance and mystery. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the warm, inviting scent of polished wood and aged leather. My compartment was quaint, with plush red seats and a small window that framed the passing scenery. As the train pulled away, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks began to lull me into a reflective state. I opened my notebook, ready to jot down any sparks of inspiration, when a sudden creak announced the arrival of a fellow passenger. He was an elderly gentleman, dressed in a suit that looked straight out of the Victorian era. His eyes twinkled with a peculiar brightness as he tipped his hat and took the seat opposite mine. "Join you?" "Of course," I replied, intrigued by his archaic attire. "I'm David. What's your name?" "Barnaby," he replied with a smile. "Quite the journey we have ahead of us, wouldn't you say?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. His tales were captivating, filled with vivid descriptions of events and people long gone. As the night progressed, more passengers joined us in the carriage, each one more peculiar than the last. There was a woman in a flapper dress, a man in a World War I uniform, and even a family dressed in colonial-era clothing. Their conversations seemed normal enough, but there was an underlying oddity in their mannerisms and speech. I decided to explore the train, hoping to understand more about these strange passengers. Each carriage I passed through seemed to be from a different time period, meticulously preserved in every detail. The dining car was straight out of the Roaring '20s, with jazz music playing softly in the background and waitstaff dressed in period attire. In the next car, I found myself among soldiers and nurses from World War II, their faces lined with the weight of their experiences. They barely acknowledged my presence as I walked by, their conversations revolving around battles and lost comrades. A growing sense of unease settled over me as I continued my journey through the train. It felt as if I was walking through a living museum, each carriage a portal to a different era. I finally reached the end of the train, where a door marked "No Entry" piqued my curiosity. Ignoring the warning, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with old maps, charts, and strange devices. At the center stood a large, ornate clock, its hands moving in an erratic pattern. As I examined it, a chilling realization washed over me. This train was not just a relic of the past. It was a vessel traveling through time. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. How was this possible? Was I dreaming? I rushed back to my compartment, hoping to find answers from Barnaby. But when I arrived, he was gone, replaced by a young woman in a medieval gown. "Where's Barnaby?" I asked, my voice trembling with urgency. She looked up, her eyes filled with a strange mix of confusion and sympathy. "Who's Barnaby?" I stumbled back. I had to find a way back to the present before it was too late. I ran through the carriages, desperately searching for anyone who might help me. The faces of the passengers blurred together, their conversations becoming a cacophony of voices from different times. Finally, I found a conductor standing at the end of one of the cars. He was dressed in a uniform from the 1800s, his expression stern and unyielding. "Please," I begged, "I need to get off this train. I don't belong here." He looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. "No one truly belongs here, sir. This train has a will of its own. It travels through time, collecting those who are lost or searching for something." "I'm not lost," I insisted. "I need to get back to my own time." He sighed and pointed to the ornate clock I had seen earlier. "That clock controls our journey. If you can find a way to set it to your time, you might be able to return. But be warned, it's not an easy task." With renewed determination, I made my way back to the clock room. The hands were still moving erratically, but I noticed a small dial at the base. I reached out, hoping to set it to the current year, but the moment my fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through me. Visions of different eras flashed before my eyes. Wars, celebrations, tragedies, and triumphs. It was as if I were experiencing the entirety of human history in a single moment. I struggled to focus, my mind reeling from the onslaught of images. Finally, I managed to grip the dial and turn it, setting it to the current year. The train shuddered violently, the lights flickering as the sound of grinding metal filled the air. I held on tightly, praying that my efforts would be enough. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my compartment, the familiar scenery of the present day passing by outside the window. The passengers around me were ordinary people, dressed in modern clothing, their conversations mundane and reassuringly normal. I breathed a sigh of relief, my heart still pounding from the ordeal. I had made it back, but the experience had left an indelible mark on me. The train came to a halt, and I gathered my belongings, stepping onto the platform with a sense of gratitude and awe. I had found the inspiration I was seeking, though not in the way I had expected. As I walked away, I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see a flicker of the past through its windows. We had always been thrill seekers, my friends and I. Our fascination with the paranormal often led us to explore haunted places. But this time, we decided to explore on a train journey. We had heard rumors of an old train with a dark history, and the stories about car number 13 intrigued us the most. According to local legend, a terrible accident happened there, and since then, The car has been haunted by the souls of the victims. We boarded the train at dusk, our excitement mixed with a hint of apprehension. The train itself was a relic from the early 1900s. Its dark green carriages and brass fittings giving it an air of faded grandeur. As we settled into our seats, the conductor, an elderly man with a stern expression, gave us a warning look. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Car number 13 isn't for the faint of heart." "We'll be fine," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We've faced ghosts before." The conductor shook his head and muttered something under his breath before moving on. My friends, Sarah, Mike, and Jason, looked at me with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "This is going to be epic," Mike said, grinning. Sarah, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "Let's just hope it's not a complete waste of time." Jason, who had been quiet since we boarded, finally spoke up. "I don't know, guys. Something feels off about this place." I want to admit it, but I felt the same way. There was an eerie silence that seemed to hang over the train, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks. As night fell, we decided to explore the train. The other carriages were empty, their darkened windows reflecting our flashlights. We finally reached car number 13, and a chill ran down my spine as we stepped inside. The air was colder here, and there was a faint, musty smell that made my skin crawl. The carriage was dimly lit by a few flickering lights, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. We took our seats and waited, the silence growing heavier with each passing minute. It started with faint whispers, barely audible over the sound of the train. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to pinpoint the source. The whispers grew louder, turning into desperate cries for help. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, but there was no one else in the carriage. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We nodded, too frightened to speak. The cries became more intense, filled with agony and despair. We could hear the sound of metal twisting and glass shattering, as if we were reliving the accident that had doomed this carriage. Then we saw them, ghostly figures appearing out of the darkness, their faces contorted in pain and terror. They moved through the carriage, seemingly unaware of our presence. One of the apparitions, a young woman with blood-streaked hair and vacant eyes, looked directly at me and screamed. The sound was so piercing, I felt like my eardrums would burst. "We need to get out of here," Jason shouted, his face pale with fear. We scrambled to our feet, but the door at the end of the carriage wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was keeping us inside. The ghosts grew more frantic, their cries echoing around us. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm and turned to see a ghostly child staring up at me with hollow eyes. Desperation set in as we pounded on the door, trying to force it open. The air grew colder, and the ghosts pressed closer, their wails filling the carriage. I felt my vision blur, the terror overwhelming me. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop, throwing us off balance. The ghosts vanished, and the door finally opened. We stumbled out of car number 13, gasping for breath. The conductor was there, his expression grim. "I warned you," he said quietly. "Some things are best left alone." We didn't need any more convincing. We hurried back to our original seats, our hearts still racing. The rest of the journey passed in a tense silence, none of us daring to speak about what we had experienced. When we finally disembarked, we vowed never to return to that cursed train. The memory of those ghostly figures and their anguished cries haunted our dreams for weeks.